Hi, this is Eric. I am the Gray Goat, and you're in the Gray Goat Garage. We're powered by ombwarehouse.com. Today we're back onto the WildCat 223 build. And like most stroker builds, this is not for the weak of heart. This still has the same 70 millimeter bore as a Predator 212 or a Ducar 212, but it has a 58 millimeter stroke versus the stock Predator stroke at 55 millimeters. That means this crank throw has a longer swing, which puts everything a little bit closer inside the engine. So what I had to do with this engine was I had to grind the bottom of the cylinder to clear the rod, but I also had to do some work on the camshaft. And with the cam card from Dyno Cam says you may have to grind between the lobes for clearancing with billet rods. Well, I did. So read the cam card. So I've got the inside of between the lobes ground off, so I have plenty of clearance now there. But because of the way the rod swings and the width of the billet rod, I also had to take some material off the side of the crank or the cam lobes for both the intake and the exhaust. So I've got both of those done now, so I don't believe I have any clearance issues, but we'll check that out and we'll know that here in a minute. So first we're going to put the crank in, and what we're going to do for the crank is we're going to put some oil on the flywheel side of the crank, because I don't want this to start on the seal on the opposite side being dry. So a little bit of lubricant right there will help. I'm also going to put some oil into the bearing in the block, just so it has some oil there, so we can get this thing started up and not have anything dry. So we're just going to gently set the crank in. And what I like to do is I like to put my flywheel on so I have something to turn the engine with. So I'm going to set the key down in the crank, and I want this key to be somewhat level with the crankshaft. So this key is a little bit looser than I care for, so I've had some challenges getting this flywheel on without pushing the key out. Okay, so we're on there nice and snug right now, and we're going to index that little nipple on the cup down into the flywheel, into the flywheel. Now I'm just going to loosely put this nut on. One thing that you may have picked up on is I put everything together, this crank slid over to the other side of the engine. When you're assembling an engine, you want to make sure that that crank is all the way seated against the inner bearing. Too many people break rod bolts by tipping the engine over like this, moves the crank out, the rod cap is not aligned to the rod, and then you'll break an ARP bolt. If you make sure that your crank's all the way butted up against that bearing, that's never going to happen to you. Personally, I've never broken an ARP bolt, and Lord knows I've tried. So we've got our piston installed on the rod. I checked the ring gaps. We're all fine there. And this rod has two little tiny dots right here. Those dots need to line up. We have to remember that this dipper comes down and scoops oil and forces it through into the bearing. And we have to have the arrow down, because this pin is offsetting this piston. If you have it backwards, you'll find out in a hurry. Okay? So we're just going to loosen up these, well, we're going to not loosen them up, we're going to take them out. Take out these rod bolts, we'll set this cap aside. Now we have to get our ring compressor, and we'll get this loosened up. And I don't want you to dip the piston or soak the rings in oil. I just want a light coat in here. What happens if you have too much oil in the rings, the oil can get in behind the rings. And then once you fire up the engine, that's going to cook everything in behind the rings, and it may leave some junk behind the rings and not allow the rings to flex as they should. So we're just going to get this piston and the rings set down in this compressor, hopefully. And then we're going to use our ultra fancy wrench to snug it down. What I want to make sure when I'm installing a piston is that everything this compressor is flat all the way around. I'm still up a little bit right here, but once we start knocking this down, we'll take care of that. So the arrow is going to go down into the cylinder. My hands are slippery, so I'm just going to get this started in here, and I want to get down beyond the skirt. So either use a plastic hammer or a rubber hammer and start that piston down in here, and then I'm going to tap on the top of this to get everything the way it should be. So right now I'm going to put some oil onto the crank journal. Make sure this stays flat, make sure the crank's all the way in, and we're just going to push that home. Okay, so now with the piston and the rod started, I'm going to rotate the crank around and keep pushing this rod until it's onto the crank journal. Okay, and I want it to stay on the crank journal while we put the rod bolts in. And with these rod bolts, we want to use some oil as a lubricant, and it doesn't take a lot. And then we want to make sure that the dot is lined up on the cap. I'm going to have to turn this crank a little bit more. And then we can start installing the rod cap. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start these bolts, everything by hand to start off with. I don't want to, wow, see, this engine's wanting to run already. I don't want to get a wrench in here right away and just start cranking on things until I know that everything has seated down against each other and is all happy together. Now this is hard with fat hands and fat fingers, but we'll rotate this crank around to get the wrench in there and to get my hands in there once we get these bolts snug down. And again, I want to go all the way down by hand, which takes some time, especially with slippery fingers because of all the oil. We'll move this to be able to get my hand in here. Now, if I was not filming this right now, yeah, I'd be all over this like a monkey. But because I'm filming, I'm trying to let you guys see what's going on here. So all the way down by hand on this, because I want to make sure that that rod cap is seated together. And you know, for all the times that I've had people say, hey, my rod's not split, it's a one-piece rod, you know, what the heck, send me another rod. And I'm like, are you sure? I'll pay you a lot of money if it's a one-piece rod, because they're actually made in two pieces and they come together, and there really is no way for that to happen. Well, the ARC billet rods are machined so nicely that you really can't even tell where the parting line is when the bolts are in there. So because of that, I always put these in by hand, make sure that they're all the way down, make sure that the rod cap halves have come together, and then I'm going to use this little tiny 12-point quarter-inch wrench just to snug them down a little bit more. Now I can see the parting line on the bottom of the rod where the two dots are. Those have come together. I'm going to tap that crank in again, make sure that there's no issues there. So at this point, I'm going to start torquing the rod down. I'm going to start this at 50 inch-pounds, not foot-pounds, inch-pounds. Now I'm going to move up in 20-pound increments. So I'm going to go to 70 foot-pounds. if you bought a torque wrench at Harbor Freight, there's nothing wrong with that wrench, and that's what Jody uses. The big deal with those is the clicker comes with some very, very stiff grease. So that wrench needs to be broken in. So to break that wrench in, put a bolt or a nut, whatever you have, into a vise and set it at 20 inch-pounds or 40 inch-pounds, whatever a low setting is on your particular wrench. Put it on the bolt in the vise, click it 20 times. Move that wrench up in another 20-pound increment and click that wrench 20 times. Keep doing the 20 times on each setting all the way up to the highest setting of that wrench. What that's going to do is that's going to break that grease loose and give you an accurate reading on the wrench. So right now we're at 150 inch-pounds. So nothing wrong with the Harbor Freight wrenches, but make sure you break it in before you do anything else. Okay? Because torque on these rod bolts is critical to the life of the engine and the rod. So having a quality wrench is definitely a benefit to you. Okay, right now we're at 170 inch-pounds on both sides. I'm going to verify that because of my old tired eyes. All right, so piston, rod, in. So at this point, I'm going to spin the crank over so the dot on the cam is about where we want it. And now I'm going to set this engine up on its end like this. Now I'm going to take my lifters, and the only part of the cam, or the only part of this engine that I'm going to use assembly lube on, is the lifters and the cam. So I just want a little splash here, a little splash here, and I'm going to give a little bit on the stems just to hold it up in the block. That'll help me get this installed without having the lifters fall out. Okay, so lifters are in. Now we're going to take and put the cam in. To get the cam in, I'm going to put some lube on the lobes. And I'm going to use a little bit on the end as well. We don't want assembly lube on the rod or the bearings because it has a tendency to not run out fast enough. So because of that, we're just going to use oil on the connecting rod. Now this is one of those things where everybody puts a cam in and then you're going to question yourself, hey, did I line the dots up? And see, like right there, I'm not lined up. But we're going to show you that here in a second if I can get this cam stabbed in here. And remember, unlike all those other YouTube heroes, this is all done live. Okay, so now I've got my dots lined up, and because these cam gears and crank gears are beveled, you can pull it out a little bit and make sure that the dot on the tooth matches the dot between the teeth on the cam, and that's all there is to it. So we've got that done now. So now we can put our side cover on and button this thing up. We have the correct gaskets for this 7-bolt block. You're going to notice there's an extra bolt hole here at the bottom. So these will be available at ombwarehouse.com. So we're just going to put the gasket up here, go over the dowel pins with it, and I'm going to put some more oil on the crank here so we don't get a dry seal. And then we're going to put a little oil into the bearing. Now we can put our cover on. Now we're going to put our cover on. It's going to go. I have a good feeling. There we go. Okay, so now we can get started with this. One thing that I haven't done in the past that I'm going to do now is drink some Kool-Aid, because this is a one Kool-Aid build for me. That's not what I was going to say, but it's good anyways. So because I know this is going on a bike, one of the OMB race bikes that has a torque converter, I know that these bolts loosening up on the torque converter can become an issue. So I am going to Loctite these bolts, because I know that everything in this engine is clean, and we're going to try and mitigate these bolts coming loose. One thing that we should always do is, after this engine gets warmed up, is to retorque these side cover bolts. The torque spec on these bolts is 17 foot-pounds, and I'm going to be a wild man, and I'm going to torque them to 18 foot-pounds. But this extra bolt down here should help this engine not, start leaking from the seal. Now you notice I don't use power tools when assembling an engine. I'm only going to use hand tools. There's too much at stake and too much taken for granted if we don't use the proper tools when assembling an engine. I'll yank apart an engine in 20 minutes using power tools, but assembling an engine, only use hand tools. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start these at 13 inch-pounds, and then I'm going to jump it up to 18, start at 13 foot-pounds and then go to 18 foot-pounds. You'll notice on the WildCat side cover, it tells you how to torque it. So we're going to start with number 1, right? So we're going to go from number 1 to number 2. What this does is this just identifies a cross pattern that we all should be using anyway, but not everybody does. What that does is that helps everything come together in a certain order where we're not putting too much pressure on one portion of the engine. I skipped number 4. We'll be all right. And finally, we're back to number 8. Okay, so then we're going to take this wrench and we're going to go up to 18 foot-pounds, go back to number 1, then to number 2, then where's 3, then to number 4, then where's 5, then we're going to go to number 6, down to 7, and then we'll end with 8, which is number 1 also. And then I'm just going to go around the horn and verify. We want this to stay together. We don't want these bolts backing out. And we've got to make sure that everything's nice and tight and torqued the way it should. Okay, so with this engine, I'm using head studs. And the WildCat, don't go out and buy just any head stud kit. It takes different length studs. So it takes shorter ones in the front of the engine and longer ones in the back. With the studs, I'm just going to screw these in by hand. I don't use Loctite. I don't torque them. I just put them in by hand. And when they don't go in by hand the way I want, Then I'm just going to double nut. Oh, these 13s. Okay, so now we can just spin these in, and I'm not going to get them tight. These are just going to remain loose. Okay, now we can back the other nut off. See if we can get this one in by hand. I'll have my trusty assistant grab what I dropped, because I always drop stuff. Before I get the head bolted on, I need to check how far up in the bore that piston is. We're already at top dead center. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a straight edge, something with a flat edge. Those bolts are slippery, like my hands. Thank you, Mr. Assistant. The other day when I did this, they screwed in all the way by hand. Now with head studs, we can use more torque on the head. The stock value for head bolt torque is 17 foot-pounds, but we're going to torque these to 20 foot-pounds just because we're using studs. Now, I know I brought the standard out, so now we're going to get our feeler gauge. We're going to put this standard across the top of the cylinder. The reason this is important, the cranks on these engines have some flex to them. Kool-Aid time. So what I'm looking for is 20 thousandths in the hole. So I'm going to measure it across the deck where the pin is, and I don't have 20 thousandths. So my calculations initially on this engine was to have it at 17 thousandths, to have it a little bit tighter with a 10 thousandths head gasket. Okay, so I can get the 17 thousandths underneath there. So that combined with a 10 thousandths head gasket will put me right at 27 thousandths clearance, which is a little on the tight side, but we want to make some power. So, excuse me, we're going to make some power. Okay, so we're going to set our head gasket on there. Now, excuse me, it takes a lot of time to port the cylinder heads on these WildCat engines. The intake, I removed probably 1/8 of inch material all the way around. It really chokes down once it goes in there. But you're also going to notice that I did port match it to the intake manifold. We're using the 22 Mikuni carb. The exhaust side already has a very generous round port. The unfortunate part about that is that I've been sick for a long time and I'm still coughing. There is no gaskets that match this up for the round port, but I've got some copper gaskets coming for this that we're going to use instead of the standard grafoil gaskets, and I'll port match that, and then I'll get it annealed so we have a good seal on the exhaust. So we're going to get our head set down. And get our bolts started. I'm missing 2 bolts. Bear with me while I get the head bolts. Please feel free to sing. On your own. And don't let me hear it, because I'll get jealous. All right, so I got the other 2 nuts for the head. I'm going to get a 13mm socket. That's going to help me get these installed on the head side. And now we're going to bust out the torque wrench again. I'm going to back this off, and we're going to start this at 13 foot-pounds because it's just a good number. For the initial torque, I won't go back and forth like we did with the side cover. But then when we do the final torque, I'm just going to go right up to 20 foot-pounds now. And for this, I'll crisscross. I'll go back and verify everything. Okay. Now, when I was putting the head together, we've got 26-pound valve springs in this head, and we're going to use the stock rockers. The rockers are the same as the Predator Hemi. The valve cover is different from the Predator Hemi, and you cannot reuse the gasket or use a Predator Hemi gasket for this. OMBwarehouse.com. We'll have the gaskets up on the site. So you have access to side cover gaskets and valve cover gaskets. That's a Predator Hemi head gasket. So I was 17 thousandths in the hole. If we add the 10 thousandths head gasket, that gives us 27 thousandths in the hole, which we're always looking for right around 30 thousandths as a safety measure for crank flex. But we're going to be happy at 27 thousandths. So now I need to torque the flywheel, which is always a challenge for me. So I've got the OMB Warehouse crankshaft tool that good-looking guy, the Gray Goat, developed. So we use this tool in this hub, and we're going to put the bolt through the hole in the side cover, hopefully. Got to make sure that here's the big thing with these engines. You have to make sure that you're using the right hardware. Some of the engines have metric threads in them. This happens to be SAE threads. So we're going to get that in, make sure. What this is going to do, this is going to lock this crankshaft down. And with this crankshaft locked down, then we can torque the flywheel. Billet flywheels from ARC. We're going to torque these to 65 foot-pounds, which is a lot. For you girls that can't put down your purse, you may want to have some friends hold the block for you. We'll have to see if I can do this without putting down my purse. Now, proper torque on the flywheel is very important. If you don't properly torque your flywheel, you could shear the key. And we don't want to shear a key. All right, flywheel's torqued down. I'm comfortable with it. You should be too. So now we can take the crank tool back out. And this is what we call almost a long block. And the reason I say almost is unlike the Predator Hemi that has a 5.54 inch push rod, these push rods were longer. These push rods are at 5.83 inches because the architecture of the head's different. So what we're going to have to do is, I've got the cut to length push rods, and I'm going to cut these down to fit this engine. So I'm going to actually measure these first and look at the valve train geometry to make sure that the geometry is correct, and then cut my push rods based upon that. If I find that it's not correct, what I may wind up doing is grinding some of this down, because with this head here, we took 60 thousandths off the head. We wanted some compression in this engine. So because I have the head milled, we're now the head's closer to the deck, so we may need a shorter length push rod, but we'll get all that checked out and then we'll get it going. Spins nice and free. This is good. This is going to be a solid engine. I'm excited about this. I am Eric. I am the Gray Goat, my garage. If you have any questions about today's show, send me an email, help@ombwarehouse.com. Put Gray Goat in the subject line, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And if you have a project like this and you're ready to start building, let me know. I'm always here to help you. Thank you.